All right, let me try again. I'm Bob Grossman. I'm retired from atmospheric and ocean sciences, and my colleague Kim Malville is retired from astrogeophysics. We want to first thank Dean John Davis for providing this wonderful venue for our 17th Distinguished Professor Seminar Performance by David Korevaar. It will be recorded, and so that you can see it again. It is being streamed presently for those who could not make it tonight on this autumnal equinox. So I wish you a wonderful evening, and I want to thank you very much for coming out on a pretty grim night in Boulder. And David, it's all yours. I want to also mention that in just a few moments, the scholar, David Korevaar, is going to appear with Carlo Cabanero, who professor of can you hear me now? Okay, I guess, yes, you're going to hear the scholar, David Korevaar, now, with his colleague, Professor of Music, Carlo Caballero, they're going to sit and discuss this music of Cécile Chaminade. I think we're seeing that she's a very powerful composer.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And it's my pleasure to introduce Carlo Caballero, for those of you who don't know him, who's musicologist here at the College of Music. I'm not sure why I'm wearing my glasses. It makes it very hard for me to see out there at all. But I'm pretending like I'm going to read something, but I have nothing to read. So we're not going to be terribly scholarly, I think. This is one of the fascinating things about Chaminade. Have a seat. Is that we know very little about her, which is particularly interesting in light of the fact that she had an extraordinary career. We were talking about that. What do we make of that?
Yeah, I think that when David asked me to join him tonight, my first response was, I am not in any way an expert on Chaminade. I know the French music in this period, and I know many composers, but Chaminade is almost invisible in the records and letters of other composers who I've studied. I've mostly worked on Gabriel Fauré, but I've also studied Ravel and Saint-Saëns and Ducasse. And where is Chaminade? I looked at their letters in the past week, looking in the index for references to Chaminade. She's quite invisible, and yet she was a very public figure and a serious virtuoso at the piano who had an international career. So I don't quite know what to make of it, except some composers are loners. And I think that Chaminade, although she enjoyed performing, obviously, and has a reputation as a sort of salon composer, was not, in a sense, a salon personality in the way that someone like Fauré was. A sort of stem winder who could spend his evenings charming people in between playing pieces. It doesn't seem that Chaminade was that kind of personality. And so those are my initial thoughts. Another example of a loner composer from this period, Albéric Magnard, Magnard, probably the greatest symphonic composer of the Chaminade, Fauré, Debussy period. And yet he's not much in the public eye outside of Boston and France, because he completely avoided social contact. There are only 3 known photographs of the man.
Yeah, Chaminade doesn't seem to have been quite as camera shy. What is interesting about her, though, is that she was a performer, and she really made kind of her bread and butter living out of these tours in particularly England and the United States. One curious thing, there's very little biographical information about her. There's a very short biography that's part of a biobibliography by Marcia Citron. And in one of the rather unusual things about Chaminade as a French composer is that it seems that all of her major large-scale symphonic works were not premiered in Paris. And that seems quite telling, like she wasn't part of that circle for whatever reasons. Another thing about her is that she was sort of segregated away from that society as when she was young, because her talent was recognized very early by some very remarkable people, including Georges Bizet. But her father would not allow her to enroll in the conservatory because that was below their class for a woman. And so she ended up being educated by all the same people she would have been educated by at the conservatory, but without the milieu of the conservatory, which meant that she got a fantastic education, but didn't know those people, and I think that's part of what you're observing.
That's exactly right. Her status as an upper middle class, I don't know if you'd say haute bourgeois, but definitely the upper echelons of the middle class in France in that period, meant that going to the conservatoire was below her station. That's where it was a craftsman's shop, and it was dominated by men. And her father's objection to her going there might be viewed as patriarchal, paternalistic, and offensive by us, but it was completely in character for a man of his class to protect his daughter from that environment, which he would see as just beneath her. But he did recognize that the masters who taught there had something to offer, and so these private lessons with the same personnel was the way that Chaminade got her education, and it certainly shows in her music, which is so accomplished. She couldn't have done that on her own in an attic. She had to have the same kind of preparation that composers like Bizet and Gounod and Saint-Saëns had. David?
Yeah. The other obvious sort of observation about her is the trajectory of her career. She starts out with a bang, and both the pieces that are on the program tonight are quite early. The trio, which you're going to hear after this little interlude, was fairly successful, and she performed it a lot with a violinist friend of hers with whom she played a lot. And it was published early on by Durand, which was probably one of the top publishing houses in Paris at the time. But what's curious is this sonata that you just heard was not published at the time of composition. The publication is considerably later. We don't know exactly when she wrote the sonata. And there's very little evidence of any performance. The only documented performance in the biography that I was able to read was of only the first movement, and only a single performance. What Chaminade became famous for was concerts entirely of her own music. She would tour, she would play solo piano pieces, mostly very short pieces. She wrote a lot of etudes, but she also wrote a lot of sort of characteristic pieces with characteristic titles. And she only played her own music, which is also a very curious thing. I can't think of anybody else of that era who would have only played her own music. And then she would, on her tours, she would either tour with singers or have local singers, because the other thing she wrote lots and lots of were songs. And that was kind of her bread and butter. And one of the results was that she would come to the United States, and she was so popular that the local amateur circles would set up Chaminade societies, which were performing circles for amateurs.
And those societies continued in the United States as late as the 1940s. She died in 1944 in Monte Carlo. David, I wanted to ask you something about her style. Listening to the sonata you just played and the trio, the first trio, I definitely recognized that she was influenced by Camille Saint-Saëns. And I don't know if you would agree with that. But listening to your performance of the sonata, as compared to others I listened to, I thought more of Liszt and Chopin than I have. There's a Schumannesque energy or frenzy in her music, but I heard a little bit more Chopin. And I'm not sure about the Liszt, because Liszt was such a special figure. Do you think that she was influenced by those two composers, Chopin and Liszt?
Well, I think Chopin was an influence that no piano composer of that period could avoid. I mean, I would say that Saint-Saëns did a pretty good job, actually, if anybody. But what I find interesting in her music and what differentiates it from a figure like Saint-Saëns is that while she exhibits some of the same neoclassicism that we find in Saint-Saëns, she's far more romantic in her willingness to be hard on sleeve. I mean, that second movement has a kind of very unforced lyricism to it that I do not associate with Saint-Saëns, who can be very lyrical, but it's usually a little artificial. And you may disagree with me on that. Saint-Saëns is very concerned with his craft being more visible, I think, than Chaminade is, maybe. And I do think I think the Lisztian influence is there. A curious biographical detail is that Chaminade's sister was married to the German pianist Moritz Moszkowski, who was very well known and also a prolific composer of salon music for the piano. He also wrote some larger works, which are, like Chaminade's larger works, basically forgotten. There's a piano concerto that gets trotted out every now and then. It's about an hour long. But the sonata I just played is dedicated to Moszkowski, who is probably a better known figure than Chaminade today. There's a few pieces that still get done. Horowitz always played Étincelle as an encore. That was a really famous. You've probably all heard that. At least if you went to piano recitals in a certain era. But a wonderful composer, and rather in the mold of Chaminade in the end, I think, except as he did have more recognition somehow, I think, after his death than she did.
One thing I've noticed about her music as I've gotten to know it over the past month is she doesn't have the problem with continuity and development of her ideas that some other composers who are better known in this period had. She has a kind of fluidity, and you'll hear this in the trio, which I think is a really magnificent piece, especially the scherzo, a real tour de force. When she starts, she seems to know where she's going in a very spontaneous and convincing manner. When you listen to the music of César Franck, a contemporary of hers, or Grieg, you can hear them struggling with a beautiful melody they've invented, but they can't quite figure out how to continue its energy. Chaminade, like Fauré and like Saint-Saëns, does not have this problem. She has this tremendous sense of energy and continuity in her music, and also a kind of great invention for figuration. By figuration, I mean the kind of background patterns that she places against her melodies and themes. She's like Saint-Saëns in that way. She seems never lacking for a graceful or sparkling or coloristic kind of figuration that brings the music constantly to life. There's a lot of vivacity and energy and craft here. I'm not saying, I don't want to make invidious comparisons to say Chaminade's a better composer than Franck, although I think that's a legitimate position to adopt as we get to know her music better. But I don't think there could be any doubt about her compositional competency and excellence. I was thinking also about the fact that these pieces in larger forms, as you pointed out, seem to all come from the 1880s and 1890s when she was in her 20s and 30s. And then in her later period, she writes mostly short pieces. Even the the concertino for flute and piano, or flute and orchestra, which is still in the repertory, is an 8-minute piece. It's not on the same scale as the trio or the sonata. So why is that? Why does she stop composing these large-scale pieces? My theory is that she saw that there was a bigger audience for the shorter pieces, both among listeners and among people who wanted to play her music. And in fact, the sonata you just heard is one of the only piano sonatas of that era in France. Fauré didn't write one. Saint-Saëns didn't write one. It was a kind of outcast genre, seen as an element of the academic past. So it's sort of curious, did she write that piece to kind of prove it to herself that she could do it? I don't know.
It's an interesting question. Of course, it's also an extraordinary sonata because it's so unsonata-like in so many ways, I find. Both the first and last movements really defy your expectations of what a sonata should be. The last movement, in fact, saw life as an etude. It was published as part of a set of 6 etudes, which were put together after the sonata was put together, but published earlier, with a later opus number. Let's not get too confusing here. And so you see how that last movement, which has a kind of through composed form that's actually rather hard to define. It sort of has an opening, and then it's got a melody that we hear twice, and then it's got a closing that's like the opening. I'm not sure what we call this. But it doesn't really resemble anything we expect as a finale of a sonata. It's not a rondo, it's not a sonata form. It's barely an ABA. The only sort of conventional movement is the second movement, which is beautifully worked out. But the first movement, when you first hear it, I think you think it's a prelude and fugue. until she gets into it. And then it's like, oh, it's actually in sonata form, but you have to pull it out. It's not at all on the surface obvious that that's what it is. So, yeah, so let's see, what other important notes to
I
hit?
think we wanted to maybe talk about the fact that she stopped composing, as far as we could tell, after a certain point.
Right.
And I have one theory about that, and maybe David has a different one.
Well, I liked your theory. I think you should share it.
Well, okay, to share this, I want to read a newspaper article from 1919. David, if you could just sort of hold the mic centrally there. This is a little long. Yeah, it really was a newspaper article from Musical America in 1919, December 25th. So an American, I printed this in a larger type so I can read it more easily. So an American journalist named O.J. Jacob goes to visit her. And he writes this very poetic article. This is very period. Saturday evening, I left Paris in the chilling slush and rain of midwinter. Paris is famous for its bad weather. The next day, I was lunching at Toulon, south of France, in the sunshine of early summer beneath waving palms. 2 hours later, I was paying a visit to Madame Chaminade at Tamaris-sur-Mer on the Mediterranean. Chaminade, who would not remember the exquisite musical lyrics, the sweet, insinuating melodies that seem to represent an epic all their own at the mention of this name. At Tamaris-sur-Mer, a short boat ride from Toulon, the charming French composer spends the winter months in a delightful dreamland at her Villa Provençale. The surroundings well befit the personality of Chaminade, who impresses one as being of some past generation. In her, one finds embodied all the grace and graciousness of a past era, of a French lady of culture and refinement, with an electrifying esprit of a day in France before democratic Bolshevik tendencies. Greedy shopkeepers and hoteliers left their detrimental imprint on the country's daily life. When Chaminade listens to your remarks, she is gentle, all attention, but when she speaks, her personality exerts the same characteristic attraction and charm as her music does. She speaks with a refinement, unfortunately not often encountered in our present, all too often vulgarly self-assertive era. Her conversation is like an over-bubbling brook augmented by those exquisitely graceful gestures, those elegant gestures that would put any Del Sar teacher to shame. As we gradually drifted into musical discussion, after all the charms and advantages of Tamaris had been duly pointed out to me, it became apparent that Madame Chaminade likes none too well the content and turn of musical development in recent years. The article goes on fairly interestingly, but what I gathered from this was a couple of things. First of all, I thought Tamaris-sur-Mer, on the Mediterranean, the south of France, a place that many yearn to visit, right? She has a villa there, and she acquired this villa through a marriage of, to all appearances, a marriage of convenience to an older man, a music publisher named Carbonel in 1901. He only lived 6 years. She cared for him in his final pulmonary illness, but then she was left with this beautiful property and apparently enjoyed a great deal of the time there. She's showing this journalist the charms of this little French village on the Mediterranean. And this is the period, 1919, when she pretty much stops composing new pieces. I thought, well, she's very comfortable. She's worked hard. She's written 400 works. And like other composers, like Rossini, like Sibelius, she simply decides she's done her piece and she's retiring. It makes perfect sense to me, also because of that last bit where she goes on in this article to deplore a lot of tendencies in modern music. So she feels a lack of interest in new musical and stylistic developments in this period. Think of what's going on, Stravinsky, Varese, Milhaud, Poulenc. She's not on board with that new modern style. So I think that's a kind of double explanation for her retirement from composition.
It seems completely credible. The other one, which is mentioned in the program, is the idea that somehow because she was a woman, she was not recognized. And I think there's probably a combination of these two things at play, but I do think the fact that she was out of her era, it's a very interesting way of looking at it, because her own compositional style never changed, right? And there are very few composers of whom you can say that, that her earliest works and her latest works are basically written in the same mode. So by 1919, that ship had long sailed. It's an interesting point. But the sad part of the story to me is that, in fact, works like the ones you're going to hear tonight have been allowed to disappear. And the hope is that we'll have more performances of these. The second piano trio is every bit as good as the first, but I think you will very much enjoy the first piano trio that you're going to hear tonight. Any last remarks, Carl?
No, I think that's a perfect segue to the performance. Great. Thanks for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you.